Okay, welcome to this lecture on nonverbal communication, one of my absolute favorite subjects. Okay, the key here is that nonverbal communication is generally speaking responsible for about 65 to 70% of what the intended message is. So 65 to 70% of the intended message is actually the stuff that's not spoken, the stuff that we don't actually say out loud and put into words. It's everything else, including things like eye contact, tone of voice, speech rate, the proximity that we are to between the sender and the receiver, what medium we use. All of these things go into the message and the eventual meaning and how it's interpreted. Okay, to really get down to it, nonverbal is all the intentional and unintentional messages that are not spoken, that are not actually the spoken word. So it could be anything outside of the spoken. And to accurately really understand where somebody's coming from, we've got to understand really where they're coming from, their cultural background, their specific situation, and sort of their point of view. This is what makes communication on a day-to-day basis with random people so darn challenging, is that we don't always have that information. Sometimes we don't have the accurate information, and this leads to a lot of misinterpretation. Okay, the face is probably the biggest nonverbal communicator, and it's responsible for most of the meaning and nonverbal messages. And this includes, everything about the face, the eyes, the mouth, your complexion, how you use your eyebrows, etc. Although basic facial expressions are pretty much universal, they subtle and spontaneous expressions we encounter tend to be a bit more difficult to interpret. The eyes are the most expressive part of the face, and they've got a huge effect on communication. This is why if you watch the World Series of Poker, they always you see guys wearing sunglasses at the poker table, and it's literally so people can't see their eyes, and use those as sort of the window of interpretation as to whether somebody's bluffing or not. In U.S. culture, eye contact goes further than that. It shows interest and attentiveness, signals whether we wish to participate, and it tends to persuade others. It also goes a lot to showing whether or not we're honest or not. The old saying that if you can't look somebody in the eye, you're probably not telling the truth, is actually pretty accurate. The eyes tell us an incredible amount about whether somebody's being accurate or not. Probably the most accurate form of a lie detector test involves looking at the pupil of the eye. Basically, what happens is that when we lie, the blood flow to the brain increases, and because it has to, we have to be more creative, okay, in coming up with the lie. This will cause our pupil to dilate or just blow up real big. It happens very subtly, but if you're looking at somebody with really light eyes, like blue eyes, like my daughter has, or light green eyes, these are you can literally see the pupil just kind of blow up when the mind is being creative. In other words, in many cases when the person is lying. So it becomes a really good way of using a lie detector, actually watching the ocular to determine if people are being truthful or not. The tough part, of course, is that in other cultures it's not always the same. Particularly in high context cultures, eye contact may be considered rude. Looking someone directly in the eye, particularly between males and females in some cultures, is rude or considered inappropriate. It may even be considered a sexual advance or something of that nature. So, in other words, we got to know the culture that we're in before we begin to interpret this stuff. Body movements and posture, things like gestures, also tell us an incredible amount as to what the message is. We study and we react to the other person's body language, what they're doing, how they're gesturing, what their posture looks like, as to whether or not we're being understood, whether we're being paid attention to, etc. I'll use myself for an example. When I'm teaching a live class and I'm involved in a live class, I can tell whether my students are paying attention by how they're sitting most of the time. And if they're all slouched down, kind of staring at the floor, good chance they're not paying attention. However, if they're kind of sitting up straight, leaning forward in much more of an attentive posture, then they're indicating to me, at least, that they're paying attention. And so while there can be a lot of misinterpretation, and this is definitely a cultural thing, it is a telling way of whether or not you're being paid attention to, whether or not the person is actually receiving your message correctly. Touch or haptics is also a big one. People from different cultures use touch really differently, but most of the time in greetings require some form of touching. In America, of course, it's the handshake. But when we also, the nature of physical contact tells us an incredible amount as to whether or not other parties are attracted to us, whether or not they're paying attention to us. Some people are more naturally touchy than others. So again, this is something that varies from person to person, but it does give us an insight into their overall motives and kind of where their head's at. And believe it or not, clothing and personal appearance are also really impactful when it comes to our nonverbals. We do, whether we like to acknowledge the old cliche or not, we judge a book by its cover. This is why there are attractive people on the news. It's not necessarily that they're the smartest person in the room, but we do find them easier to look at. Clothing and appearance really say a lot about our status, our credibility, whether or not we're persuasive. This is why we dress up to go to interviews, and I always tell people, conservative dress is important when you're interviewing. The reason behind that is because it really affects people's perceptions of your credibility, whether or not you know what you're talking about. Now, that may be, that's up to the individual to determine whether that's a fair thing or not, but the reality remains that the average person does look at it that way. And so they make assumptions about us based on what we wear, how we look, and what our general appearance is like. This is a great little slide here. I'm not going to get into it in a great degree because you can all read it, but it does give a nice little overview of what are considered the conservative casual ways of achieving professional dress and a sort of a professional appearance. So definitely something that we want to pay attention to. One of my personal favorites, distance or personal space, also known as proxemics. This differs widely from culture to culture. Many people are kind of unaware of it, but in typically in collectivistic cultures, they need less space. In individualistic cultures, we need more. But it's an interesting phenomenon, the study of the space between people and how people use that space to their advantage or not so. In America, we reserve intimate distance for private use. In other words, that sort of personal distance. We usually have a professional conversation zone of about 3.5 to 5 feet. Somewhere in that distance, we generally feel comfortable standing and talking with somebody and engaging in personal interaction. If you ever want to freak people out, decrease that distance. Once you decrease that distance, there's something about it that we notice it, and people will react to it. I took part in an experiment many years ago where we used proxemics as an example of how we could push people around. Basically, we took a young girl who was very small in stature, and we trained her up on what to do. And then we brought in members of the football team who were big mountainous individuals, and we gave them extra credit to walk down to the end of the hallway and have and talk to our young college co-ed female. And what we had instructed her to do is that when she felt comfortable, we wanted to have her just step forward and invade their bubble, in other words. When she did that, depending on how they reacted, if they took a step back, she could, when she felt comfortable, take another step forward, all the time engaging them in conversation about whatever she wanted. In one case, one of our football players got pushed 483 yards down the hallway, down the stairs, outside, through the library, and eventually into the courtyard next to the library. And the only thing that would happen was this young girl would step into his space bubble, and he would immediately take a step backwards because he felt uncomfortable. And that's sort of the power of proxemics and how it all plays out. One thing to always kind of keep in mind with regard to nonverbals, be aware of it. Be aware of people's reactions to your personal space and their personal space. People will give you clues, things like stepping backwards and the words, and it's our job to sort of react to those clues. Remember, as people who have studied this stuff, which now you have, you sort of share the burden in reacting to it properly and reacting to those distance requirements. The physical environment also has, does a lot to influence communication. Things like color affect our emotional response. It's the reason that as you sit in a college classroom, everything's sort of a neutral tone. We don't tend to paint too many walls bright red and things like that, or jet black. The reason is because by choosing a more neutral tone, we actually have done some studies that it keeps people calmer. Lighting in the room is also important. If you've got too much, people tend to be really annoyed really quickly. If you have too little, people don't. Excuse me. People don't pay attention very well. Let's see, noise level, heat, ventilation, lack of windows, all of these go, pitch into the to the communication ideal and affect things both verbal, and affect the messages that we're trying to send and receive. And for improving your nonverbal skills, one of the things I always tell people is be very aware of what I call expectancy violation theory. Generally speaking, we operate on a day-to-day basis in the realm that we expect. People interact with each other in expected patterns. Okay, and so as a result of that, we're generally speaking very comfortable. But when those expectations are violated, people get decidedly uncomfortable. For instance, next time you're on an elevator, think about what people do in an elevator. They walk in, they turn around, they push the button, and then they stare at the ceiling and wait for their floor. The next time you get onto an elevator, make sure you're the last person on, and if the elevator's particularly full, press your button, and then turn around and face the people who are behind you and start a conversation. You'll watch people just freak out. The reason is you violated their expectation, and by doing that, you will produce a very uncomfortable reaction. So in general, we want to stay within established parameters, and that's kind of the point. And this slide goes to why. Generally speaking, if our expectations are met, we view people very positively. If they're not met, we view the person very negatively. And to finish up, probably the most important thing is creating habits that are good. Those effective habits. Develop those awarenesses of verbal and nonverbal behaviors. Don't always judge according to your own standard, and be very, very aware of the impact of culture on the ways that people perceive us. Also, if necessary, and particularly, for big events, role play using hypothetical situations. You'll find that very, very helpful. Thank you, and that's it for today.